Unmuting for scapegoat survivors of narcissistic parents. Become the author of your life. A child born to a narcissistic parent is a character in that parent's fictional story. And the story the parent tells themselves is so self-aggrandizing that it's often devoid of fact. Nonetheless, the child must find a way to remain in the parent's story or have no reality to share with that parent. This means going along with the character that your parent writes for you. So what sort of story does a narcissistic parent write for themselves? Well, one where they are always the hero and someone else is always the villain. The hero is immune to feeling anything but superior. Inferiority is represented by the villains. This story protects the narcissistic parent from the feelings of worthlessness that might otherwise consume them. The next task is getting other people in life to play their parts in the story. So the narcissistic parent coerces their child into playing the part of scapegoat. The parent uses the 3 Ds, that is, devaluing, depriving, and domineering, to make the child identify with this part of scapegoat. The child is vulnerable to this coercion because they have to assume that the parent only treats them in the ways that the child deserves. So let's review how the 3 Ds lead the child to believe they are the scapegoat. Well, we feel devalued when someone treats us like we're less than we actually are. So if mom or dad treats the child like they can do nothing right, then it must be because the child is incompetent. And we feel deprived when someone withholds affirmation, encouragement, or interest in response to our actions. So if mom or dad deprive the child of the love and attention needed to develop self-worth, then it must be because the child does not deserve anything more. And we feel domineered when someone else makes choices for us and then threatens punishment if we don't go along with those choices. So if mom or dad domineers the child by telling them what to do all the time, then it must be because the child cannot make good decisions for themselves. The 3 Ds put pressure on the child from without to think, feel, and act as though they are worthless. The child faces another pressure from within themselves to do the same. Failing to go along with the parent's story risks getting written out of it, and that is not an option. Children must find themselves in their parent's story. If their parent excludes them, then the child can feel like nobody to no one. They become someone who does not belong to any narrative. It's both terrifying and unbearable. So the scapegoat child pressures themselves to be an inferior character in their parent's story rather than have no part in the story. Adapting to these two forms of pressure to become the scapegoat means the child must mute themselves. They cannot unmute because their parent won't recognize them in that form. Living unmuted means knowing and expressing what you need, want, and don't want. That requires a parent who greets such expressions with respect and empathy. So the scapegoat child has to mute the most alive parts of their existence to play the role they are given. It may not be until childhood is over that it becomes feasible for the scapegoat survivor to gradually unmute themselves. In today's video, I'm going to explain how the adult scapegoat survivor can unmute themselves by reclaiming authorship over their lives. To do this, you must write a new ending to your story. And this ending should have 3 features that correspond to the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is to make sense of the narcissistic abuse to know that it wasn't your fault. As you write your own ending to your story, you go from being the villain to the hero. And in so doing, you see how the old role of villain or scapegoat was never accurate nor deserved. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers and closeness to safe people. You develop your new story only with editors and readers who are supportive. You deliberately filter out audiences that are critical and or undermining. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of your narcissistic parents' rules. So now you author plot lines that demonstrate your worth and deservedness. Taken together, these pillars empower you to know you can now be safe to unmute and live with the volume up on who you really are. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a practicing licensed psychotherapist in California and a scapegoat survivor myself. I've worked to understand what helps such survivors know they are now safe to unmute. And this has led me to these 3 pillars of recovery. If you'd like a low-cost option to understand and apply the 3 pillars of recovery in your own life, then I suggest checking out my Rise and Reclaim Healing Toolkit for Scapegoat Survivors. In it, you'll receive my book called Growing Up as the Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. This book is a comprehensive and in-depth guide to the 3 pillars of recovery. If you're a scapegoat survivor, you'll likely find a lot of your own experience in these pages. Most importantly, you'll see how to apply the 3 pillars in your own life so that you can reclaim the quality of life you deserve. And in the toolkit, you also receive a worksheet that asks you to brainstorm ways to apply the pillars on a monthly basis. You can find the link to the toolkit in the description box below. The narcissistic parent story that led to Brent muting himself. So Brent was a fictitious client who I'm going to describe here. He was born to a narcissistic father who severely struggled in his own life to feel like he was enough. His father was an intelligent and successful business owner who saw himself as knowing far more than everyone around him. He treated his employees like they did not know what they were doing. He'd invariably find an employee that he could pick on the most. Usually this would be a younger employee who seemed eager to advance their career. Brent's father would initially show interest in this employee and then inexplicably turn against them. He'd openly question the accuracy of their work, their conduct in meetings, and whether he could trust them. The employee would typically get alarmed and work harder to stay in his graces. Cultivating these scapegoats at work gave Brent's father a much-needed boost. He found it much easier to quell his fears that he was not enough when he could look down on someone else who seemed far less enough than he was. His father treated his mother like she was lower status than him. Nothing she said or did seemed right to him. He would correct her at every turn. This kind of criticism seemed normal to her because her own father had treated her mother this way. When Brent was born, his father was initially over the moon. He thought he had someone he could mold into a mini version of himself. And so it seemed for the first 3 years of Brent's life when he was completely dependent on and obedient to his father. But when Brent turned 3, however, he began to experiment, like most 3-year-olds, with saying no to what he did not want. One day his father told him to pick up his toys, and Brent yelled no. His father felt like he had been kicked by a mule emotionally and was going to get revenge. He scowled with immense contempt at Brent and barked, "What? You're going to listen to me when I tell you what to do, little boy." He grabbed Brent hard by his arm and pushed him onto the floor towards his toys. Brent went from defiant in his no to appropriately terrified of this big adult man being so enraged with him. Brent felt like a hole had opened up in him and he just wanted to sink into it and lose consciousness. This moment marked a break in the bond between father and son. His father saw Brent's defiance as a betrayal that he would never forgive. Brent now seemed like a threat to his father's inflated yet very fragile self-worth. The only way his father could feel protected from the threat Brent posed was to devalue, deprive, and domineer him. Doing this made Brent live in constant fear of being bullied, demeaned, and ashamed. Such fears led to muting any thought, desire, or feeling that didn't align with what his father expected from him. As Brent turned 5, he started kindergarten. He'd look at the other kids and they seemed so carefree and happy. During playtime, Brent would not know what to do with himself. He was so used to being told what to do. He was afraid to pick up a toy or play with a friend just because he wanted to. That felt like he was doing something forbidden. He could only join other students in whatever it was they were playing. He couldn't initiate his own forms of play. Another cost of having to mute himself at home. Why adult scapegoat survivors stay muted. As an adult, it may seem like it should be possible to just unmute yourself like that. After all, everything described so far has happened in childhood. So why should it affect you today? Well, attachment theory and research explains why it does. Attachment just means the study of how children bond to their parents and how that process affects them later in life. This body of work has shown that children must form a bond of some kind with their parent in order to survive. No matter how abusive or neglectful, the child will find a way to do this. A scapegoat child finds a way to bond to their parent by muting themselves to go along with the parent's devaluation, deprivation, and domineering. That is the 3Ds. So you learn to associate being muted with being bonded to the person you need most. More generally, you learn that muting yourself makes you safe and speaking up puts you in danger. These lessons persist into adulthood because they are learned when we're forming our fundamental assumptions about what parts of ourselves are acceptable versus unacceptable and what we can expect from others. It's essential to form such assumptions because you'd not survive if you had to assess every situation as if it were new. Imagine a young child who's told to stay away from handles that protrude from the stovetop because they might be hot. The child will benefit from staying away from all pan handles on stoves without testing to see if each one of them is hot or not. A scapegoat child does the same with the lessons learned from how to bond with their narcissistic parent. The child forms assumptions that what worked with this parent will work with everyone else. So they mute themselves as a way of life. Similarly, what did not work with the parent to bond will not work with anyone else. So they avoid unmuting in general. Scapegoat children go on to unconsciously develop beliefs that keep them muted and therefore safe. In order to convincingly play the part of scapegoat in your parent's story, you may have had to unconsciously conclude that you were defective and undeserving. Such beliefs are highly adaptive to avoid the danger of being written out of your parent's story. When you believe there is something wrong with you, then you can more readily accept your parent's devaluation. When you believe you don't deserve as much as others, then you can more readily accept your parents' deprivation and domineering. Well, let's go back to Brent. After college, he moved to the city where he grew up and took a job as a history teacher. He didn't consider moving farther away from home. Something within him told him that he must be near his father. During the week, his father would text Brent that he needed to help with one house task or another on the weekend. Brent knew that he couldn't deny his father's demands. In fact, he couldn't even picture himself saying no to him. This meant that most of Brent's weekend afternoons would be spent at his father's house. He'd be instructed on what task he had to do: paint the outside fence, clean the basement, mow the lawn, take items to the city dump, etc. And once Brent started, it was a matter of when, not if, his father would find something wrong with what he was doing and yell at him. He might say something like, "What the hell are you doing, Brent? I told you to do it this way. Obviously, you don't care about what I told you. You're just trying to get this done carelessly so you can leave here and go do whatever it is you do." Brent would feel that long familiar enveloping shame come over him in such moments. He felt like a rotten soul. The only thing he could do to make himself feel better in these moments was clamor for his father's forgiveness. He might say, "I'm sorry, Dad, you're right. I'll try harder to do a better job for the rest of the afternoon. I promise." If his father showed a slight letting up in his contempt for Brent, then he could feel some relief from the shame. Brent's father was the person who was hurting him and the only person who could take away the hurt. At this point in his life, Brent had to stay close to his father. On occasions where he had plans where he couldn't go to his father's house, he'd feel worse than when he could or would have to go to his father's house. He'd feel like he was betraying his father. In these moments, his father seemed like a poor and innocent person who depended on Brent for help. And Brent would feel like he was shirking his responsibility to take care of his father's emotional well-being. All of this led to searing guilt for Brent. He'd also feel like something was just off if he wasn't sacrificing his happiness to do his father's bidding. Brent's tried and tested way of staying in his father's story and not becoming nobody to no one was still in place at this point. This was why Brent felt so bad when he didn't comply with his father's demands to help at the house on the weekends. His body and mind were conditioned to associate such independence with the greater threat of becoming nobody to no one, getting written out of his father's story. There were times when Brent registered feeling disrespected by his father, though. It might be in the way his father barked an order at him, or how he felt entitled for Brent's help, regardless of Brent's plans each weekend. Brent would feel angry and might even consider speaking up to his father, but in these moments, a flood of counter thoughts would come in. Brent would think, he wouldn't be speaking to me in this way if I was more conscientious about my work. Or, I know that I make people angry with how I am, so dad is just being honest with me, while others hide it. If these kinds of thoughts did not eradicate his impulse to speak up or unmute, then he would get hit with a feeling of despair that he simply had no right to do so. He'd feel less than his father and like it was an impossibility to protest anything about how his father was treating him. Brent's unconscious beliefs that he was defective and undeserving muted his anger at his father's disrespectful treatment. Brent would conclude that there was something wrong with him, so whatever he said would be incorrect. And if that didn't work to mute him, then he would just conclude that he had no right to speak up. Unmute yourself by reclaiming authorship of your life. Well, if you're watching this, then you may have already begun to question your role in your narcissistic parent's story. And this is an important step towards establishing a better quality of life for yourself. You get to consider becoming the author of your own life. The problem is that you have not had the necessary support to write your own story. As promising as moving from a character in another story to the author of your own may seem, it can also be disorienting and scary. Become the hero in your own story. Becoming the author of your own life is made easier by incorporating the 3 pillars of recovery. First, as the author, you get to reevaluate how and why you had to play the part of scapegoat in the first place. As you make sense of what happened, pillar number 1, you get to see how the scapegoat character reflects the disturbance of your story's prior author, not your own. And this can free you up to develop your character into the hero in the story. Up until now, you have had to play the villain to your parent. As the hero in your own story, you see how living as the scapegoat was one of the trials you had to face before getting to where you are today. Instead of feeling defeated by your narcissistic parent's abuse of you, you may cultivate an admiration towards yourself for surviving it. You might see it as a test of your character that you passed. These new perspectives may not yet feel true, but are more possible to consider. They all undermine the assumptions that led to you muting your true preferences, ambitions, and desires in childhood. Well, when Brent was 25 years old, he began to date a woman named Sonia from work. Sonia seemed to like Brent for who he was. She'd regularly tell him that she appreciated his best qualities. These included his sense of humor, intelligence, resilience, and work ethic. Brent wasn't accustomed to such compliments, but he wasn't as uncomfortable with them as usual. Something about Sonia and being around her felt calming to him. He found that he liked to hear her thoughts about him in these ways. They actually seemed true to him when she spoke them. After a few months of dating and growing closer, Brent decided to introduce her to his father. They had dinner one Sunday night at his father's house. The meal consisted of his father boasting to Sonia about his professional accomplishments, along with put-downs of Brent. He said, "Does he act like he doesn't hear you too, Sonia, when you ask him for help?" Or, "Brent has been a selfish kid from the get-go. I've had to work hard to wean that out of him." Or, "Whenever Brent comes over to do something around the house, I know I've got to be ready to redo whatever it is he does. I mean, he's just not a very handy guy. But he tries, I suppose." Well, on the drive home, Sonia blurted out, "Oh my gosh, Brent, your father is terrible to you. I wasn't even sure who he was talking about with all of his criticism. None of that matches my experience of you." Brent said, "Really? I guess I'm just so used to it. It never seemed like a big deal." And she replied, "I think your father might be what they're calling a narcissist these days. He seems to only feel right if he's putting you down. And he makes up things about you to insist that you deserve to be put down. It's not right. I'm going to send you a link to this Reddit thread called Raised by Narcissist and see if any of it resonates with you." Well, later that night, Brent started reading the accounts of people on Reddit whose childhoods sounded very similar to his. He read about people who felt that they could do nothing right in the eyes of their parent. He learned the term scapegoat and found this role particularly representative of what he went through. Brent was on the path towards recognizing that the abuse he suffered from his father was undeserved. He learned it was a result of his father's psychological disturbance. Find a supportive audience. You're developing your story in ways that would have led to disaster as a scapegoat child. In order to find it safe enough now to do this, you must surround yourself with people who react far differently to your worth than your narcissistic parent did. This means identifying and gaining distance from people who want you to keep playing the part of scapegoat. And that's what pillar number 2 is all about. Next is the task of finding a writing coach or editor to help you understand where you want your story to go and support you in your efforts to get there. Therapy can offer such a writing coach as you author your own life. The coaching that happens in therapy sessions for scapegoat survivors is neither punitive nor scrutinizing. Rather, your coach or therapist in this case has full faith in your ability as an author. They see their job as to collaborate with you to identify what stands in the way of you becoming the author that you both know you're capable of. Their questions will be more like, what's in the way of you being proud of your writing ability? Rather than, well, why did you write it this way? Establishing such a receptive audience with your coach today lets you know it's safe to unmute. In my clinical work with scapegoat survivors, they may worry that they have nothing to say even if they could unmute. Another fictitious client, Joan, for example, said that she felt like she had nothing interesting to say at a dinner with 2 friends last week. As we dug into how these specific friends were acting at dinner, Joan realized that they did not seem willing to listen to her. They seemed most interested in getting out what it was they had to say. They seemed to wait until the other person was finished talking so that they could add their own prepared story. Joan didn't see evidence that they were genuinely interested in what she had to say. All of this information helped Joan and I conclude that it was not that she had nothing to say. Rather, she was muting herself because it wasn't safe to unmute with these particular friends or people. We can't say what we have to say when we question whether we're going to be listened to. Working with a therapist as a coach in this sort of metaphor ensures that you will be listened to as you practice using your voice. In her sessions, Joan was never at a loss for words. I think this was because she knew I was interested in and would be responsive to whatever she said. She could put me out of her mind and pay attention to herself. These are the kinds of conditions that let her know she was safe to unmute, that doing so would not threaten the therapeutic bond. Well, let's return to Brent. As Brent learned more about his father's pathological narcissism, he decided to take the recommendation he kept finding in the literature he was reading and find a therapist for himself. So he reached out to me as someone who specialized in recovering from narcissistic abuse. And as we began to meet, it was clear to me that Brent was caught between 2 worlds. First, the world he had to stay muted in because he was supposedly defective and undeserving. And second, the world that he and Sonia were beginning to occupy, where his strengths were recognized and admired. Brent clearly found the latter world preferable, but he needed to discover that the old fears of becoming nobody to no one would not get realized if he left the world that he had known. Brent would test this out in our sessions. He might offer a story about himself where I felt invited to criticize him. One day he said, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I can't figure out what to talk to my dad about. I want to come up with a topic that's neutral and doesn't result in him getting on my case, but my mind goes blank. I wonder if I have ADHD or something. In such moments, I saw what Brent was doing as offering up a hypothesis that there was something wrong with him. And I understood that Brent was in therapy to disprove this hypothesis. In this case, I said, Brent, I think it's really hard for anyone to think clearly when they are around someone determined to find a reason to criticize them. I'm more inclined to think that this is why your mind goes blank around your father. There may not be a conversation topic you can bring up that will not result in his criticism. I would know I was on the right track with Brent because he would appear relieved after such statements. Therapy was going to take a considerable amount of time for him to know he can surrender the scapegoat identity that he was forced to adopt in his upbringing in favor of the more authentic identity based on his strengths that Sonia clearly saw and communicated to him. But Brent was in the process of learning that the old threat of becoming nobody to no one if he was not the scapegoat to his father would no longer come to be. His new relationships with people who supported him using his voice would make this possible. Write new chapters. Having taken over as the author and surrounded yourself with a supportive audience, you can now write new chapters for yourself. The plot line for your chapters centers on discovering your adequacy and deservedness. This involves knowing your goals and writing your story in ways that moves you closer to them. These new chapters follow the arc of you knowing what you want for yourself, but coming up against obstacles that tell you it is too dangerous to pursue. The hero of your story, which is now you, gets to overcome these obstacles. For example, another again fictitious client, Barry, had always felt called to paint. He looked at the world as potential pieces of art that he might create. Yet due to how defective he had learned to experience himself to be, painting resulted in anxiety and crippling self-doubt. It made doing what he loved into a painful and futile process. About a year into his work in therapy, he began writing chapters where he reapproached painting. And I mean writing in terms of living differently. This time, he had awareness that his anxiety and self-doubt were not what they seemed. They were not accurate reflections of his ability. Instead, they were legacy warning signals that he was about to do something that would have been far too dangerous to do as a child. He was about to unmute a core part of himself. In these chapters of his new story, Barry would learn that nothing catastrophic happened when he painted today. So perhaps you overcome the legacy of having to believe you are undeserving by acting as if your needs are as important as other needs. Or maybe you write a chapter where you set a boundary with your job and decide not to answer email on nights and weekends. Despite fearing becoming nobody to no one all over again, you might press on and discover that your colleagues and supervisor don't react like your parent to your assumption that you have a right to set boundaries in your life. So let's return to Brent once more. Having seen the falseness of his father's reality, how he had to adapt to survive, and the presence of Sonia and his therapist in his life, Brent was ready to practice unmuting himself. He could now listen to his anger at his father's demands for a lot longer. He would discuss his reactions with Sonia and his therapist and feel validated in his feelings. As these experiences accrued, he took more and more offense at his father's entitled expectation that Brent be his weekend helper. He told his therapist and Sonia that he intended to tell his father he couldn't keep visiting him every weekend. He worked through his fears of his father's retaliation if he did this. His therapist and Sonia helped him see how he was in a very different position today than he had been before. Brent no longer had to keep his father happy with him in order to survive. He could say what he will not accept from his father and know that he had Sonia and his therapist in his corner. He would no longer lose the only person he had by unmuting himself. Well, I hope you found today's video useful if you're in the process of unmuting yourself after recovering from a childhood as a scapegoat to a narcissistic parent. And again, I always want to thank you for your continued support and engagement with this channel and the resources that surround it and with each other. You know, reading people's comments in the comment section and the support offered and the just sharing of each other's story that really, I think, kind of demystifies and makes it a lot less of a maybe lonely fact that one can be the scapegoat in their family of origin. I think it's just so important. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.